Welcome. Thank you all for joining. We're going to begin. I know that you probably saw some survey questions up. If you didn't have a chance to answer those, we'll put them back up again at the end of the panel. So I am Melanie Subin. I'm Managing Director of the Future Today Institute. In my job, I do a lot of work with data, the purpose of data, how we should be using it in the future, how we should be managing and controlling it. And with me today, I have two very special guests, Astha Kapoor, who is co-founder of the Aapti Institute, which is a Bangalore-based research firm that works on the intersection of technology and society. Astha has over a decade of public policy and strategy consulting experience. She has a focus on the use of technology for welfare. And at Aapti, Astha leads the Data Economy Lab, and that is a vertical that's established to research and test new methods of data sharing, data stewardship, and data governance. Astha's recent work has focused on the participative governance of data and its in collaborative AI through collective governance methods, such as cooperatives. So thank you, Astha, for joining us. We also have Professor Sylvie Delacroix. Her focus is considering the inherent potential in bottom-up data trusts as a way of reversing the current top-down fire brigade approach to data governance. Sylvie co-chairs the Data Trusts Initiative, which is funded by the McGovern Foundation. Professor Delacroix has served on the Public Policy Commission, on algorithms in the justice system, the Law Society of England and Wales, as well as the Data Trusts Policy Group, which is under the UK AI Council. Sylvie is also a fellow of the Alan Turing Institute. Her latest book, Habitual Ethics, was published by Bloomsbury in August 2022. Thank you, Sylvie, for joining us. So today, I know the topic of the panel that you came to was how much value is our data going to have in the future. We're going to discuss that, but we're also going to discuss how we should manage that data, how we need to protect data in the future, and the value that it can have not only to individuals, but also to communities. So to begin, I'd love to hear from both of you on what the current data ecosystem looks like today. Is there a data ecosystem today? We have lots of wearable devices, connected devices, sensors, and so forth, collecting enormous amounts of data. Is there currently a data ecosystem that is collecting and managing that? Sylvie, let's start with you.
Okay, that's quite a big question. First, I should say there's lots of people standing at the back. There's lots of room at the front, so please take a seat. It's more comfortable. So the ecosystem, I mean, you can't give an honest answer to that without first noticing that, of course, there are huge differences across countries, right? But you can isolate key trends, and I'm going to speak about two key trends. The first one is, yes, there is definitely an increase in top-down regulatory interventions that are meant to give us rights, data rights. And we mean portability, access, erasure rights, some version of that, right? Now, that top-down regulatory intervention trend is increasing, and in some ways is great news. We need the rights that they are establishing, but, and there's a big but, it's not enough. And so the second trend that I want to emphasize today is one that is no less important, whereby increasingly I think there's an amount of frustration about the number of common goods that are not being achieved. And by common goods, I mean healthcare, I mean better use of natural resources, I mean better education. These common goods could be achieved better and quicker if only we were better at sharing data, right? So there is growing amounts of frustration about why we are not doing this better. And the answer to this has to take the form of bottom-up empowerment infrastructure. Yeah, so for me, it's essential that we wake up to the fact that top-down regulatory interventions, that's all very good, but we also need bottom-up empowerment infrastructure. And I'm just going to say this, right? I think it's really important if once we have this infrastructure, that we start kind of challenging this dichotomy between supposedly what's personal data on one hand, and on the other hand, what's supposed to be communal data. As soon as you empower groups to get together and to have a say over how they want to use their data, for what purposes, which might include common goods, then you start realizing that this dichotomy is not helpful, and that you can actually marry a concern for protecting the vulnerability of people and achieving those common goods in one intervention. And that's what we're going to talk about, I think, today.
That was such a great explanation, and I love how you talked about the value of data in creating some of those common goods. Astha, I know that you're very focused on community benefits of data collection and data use. Can you talk a little bit about how individual data could become community data and could help us to achieve some of those common goods?
Yeah, so to take off from where Sylvie left off, which is that that dichotomy between what is individual data and what is community data needs to be something that we need to re-examine, because data is a relational good. The information about me impacts, women in India, for instance, and the information about women in India impacts me personally. Nobody is, or when Facebook targets ads, they're looking at your population type, right? They will put you in multiple buckets. That is not just your experience, but the experience of others like you. So that gap, which is of what is personal, yes, my name, my phone number, that is personal, but then the way that I engage with the data economy is happening at a communal level, which we don't often see because we are so atomized in our digital lives. And that's the work that we've been also trying to do, is to say that data is not just an individual issue, though those individual rights are absolutely critical, which is of privacy, of erasure, of portability, of interoperability, all of that. But there's also a broader question around rethinking how we think about these rights as a community. And there are multiple questions that can come once we sort of we changed the way that we think about this problem, right? So, when we think about harm, we think that all harm is of individual privacy. We don't necessarily think about group privacy, but when there is violence against certain kinds of groups, when there's exclusion against certain kinds of groups, that's happening at a community level. Similarly, value is also possible to think about, as Sylvie said, as a common good, as a community good. So we've just come, hopefully at the end of this pandemic, but realizing that thinking about health outcomes and sharing data meaningfully to address questions around quarantine or access to vaccines, etc., are all community questions that have relied on group data. So there is a huge possibility, and what is lacking in the current way that we think about data is that we only think of it at the individual level. Regulation has been extremely blind to the fact that data is relational. It is a common, or collective good as well. And the part of what we are trying to do, both Sylvie and I, in our own sort of trajectories, are trying to build those institutional mechanisms that help harness this ability of groups to deploy data in the ways that they think is meaningful, as well as prevent harms that come to groups from that data.
So, excellent points that I want to dive into, but before we do, can we define a little bit about what types of data we're talking about? So Sylvie, maybe you can begin. What kinds of data are we talking about when we're saying it's being collected, it needs to be managed, and that it can bring value and benefits?
Okay, that's again a big question, and there's no single answer to that, but I think it's helpful to be concrete here. So I'm going to start with this. Yeah, we all often, I'm sure, go shopping online, right? Now, when we go shopping online, we sometimes use platforms, like think of Amazon as a big, famous platform. Now, at the moment, we all have to sign a little consent form that asks us if we are ready to share X and Y type of data. Now, do any of us actually read the terms and conditions? I doubt it. I certainly haven't. My life is too short. So what do? We basically click away. We click away the consent window. Now, is that turning consent into a meaningful, helpful thing? No, it's not. It's making a joke of it. Now, what is a hopeful scenario, in my view, and one that is not that distant in the future, I hope, is one where instead of clicking away those consent windows, we can join a data trust or some form of bottom-up empowerment infrastructure. And by data trust, basically, I mean a structure that enables people to pool together the rights they have over their data in order to negotiate better terms and conditions with service providers like Amazon, or, for instance, monitor data sharing agreements, right? Now, I'll give you this very concrete example. If data trusts were to become successful, we have launched the first data trusts. They are a reality, they're not just a theory at the Data Trust Initiative. Now, once they become a big thing and sufficient number of people join them, you could imagine a data trust that talks to Amazon and say, either you are willing to talk to us, let's say we have 1 million people in our data trust, and you are willing to change the terms and conditions that govern the collection of all the people in my data trust who will go and shop on Amazon, or I tell those people to go shop elsewhere, and I exercise the right to portability en masse, and I transfer this data to an emerging competitor. Now that would change the game, right? This is just one example whereby we each have rights, for instance, a portability right. But do many of us use those rights? No. For a simple reason, it takes time, it takes resources. You put in place structures that enable people to pool the rights they have over their data and entrust a trusted intermediary, in this case a data trustee, who'd be working like a professional, like a lawyer or a doctor. In this case, you'd have a data trustee. Then suddenly you can exercise power that comes in numbers, right? And leverage those rights to, in this case, opt-in, but in terms and conditions. You can also do all sorts of things, like share data for healthcare research, share data for better use of natural resources, etc. So I'm just going to stop there, because it's already a long answer.
So who's leading these data trusts? And if they're not regulated tightly, then what incentivizes them to take actions or institute policies that protects individuals' right to portability, control, and so on? What differentiates these data trusts from any other technology company that's collecting or managing our data?
Is that for me?
Yes.
Okay. So, so this is a good question, and there's several levels to my answer. The first level is to say, okay, these data intermediaries do need the strongest level of institutional safeguard you can come up with. And this is the reason why I've been working on data trust rather than alternatives like data co-ops, because data co-ops are based on contracts. And contracts don't typically come with levels of safeguards that you see when you create a trust. When you create a trust, you have a court overseeing it that can intervene, replace the data trustee if he or she is shown to not act in the best interest of the people in the trust, etc. So there's institutional safeguards that are built in, but that's not enough. On top of it, you want multiple layers of safeguards, right? So on the other hand, you want, because the data trustee is a professional, he or she will be a member of a professional body with institutional oversight as well at that level. And then just like medicine today, progress in the medical sciences in the 19th century gave rise to the medical profession. I think today, in the 21st century, it's high time we saw a new profession. And that new profession, I call them data trustees. Frankly, they can just be called data intermediaries. And it's very important to understand that this is not going to work unless you insist on strict, robust independence. Just like we wouldn't trust doctors who would be working for big corporations that make profit from blood tests, let's say. We shouldn't trust data intermediaries that are somehow affiliated with big platforms and have then competing interests. Yeah? So those data intermediaries need to be held to robust absence of conflict of interest and loyalty duties. Okay? And then on top of that, I would actually create national oversight bodies. Just like we have a charity commission, we should have a data trust commission, for instance. That's a full answer to your question.
Astha, I see you nodding along. Can you talk a little bit about, you've done a lot of work around a collective approach to data management and a community-based approach. What kinds of data are being used or are needed from a community sense? And how is that data managed? Is it through a data trust or should it be managed differently?
So, like Sylvie said, the type of data question is a big one, and because every community has a different data journey, a different data experience, and value is derived in different ways. So an example is that we've been working with a women's cooperative in the western part of India. They're an agricultural cooperative, so they do a lot of work around collectivizing agricultural inputs and making sure that women's farmers get seeds, fertilizer on time, and often, the the sort of value chains are broken with the government or other providers, so the cooperative serves as an intermediary. And they're already doing this. They're pooling assets such as seeds, they're pooling assets such as capital, and we've been talking to them about pooling another asset that they have, which is data, in order to be able to get the community or their members better, say, loan products or better insights from soil, and collectivize that and make that available either for research or for, like I said, getting better and more sort of tailored products for themselves. So every community's data needs are different. I mean, we've studied this example of a data cooperative, again, out of San Francisco, where app workers are pooling their data to enable better insights, which is helping them manage their wages, as well as negotiate with platforms such as Uber or make data available to their municipalities to better urban planning. So there are different pathways, but the cooperative structure to me is an interesting one to be able to do that. One is because it's a well-known structure. There are rules around it. There's a board, there's a decision-making, and it's sort of existed for a while, which is as a structure that has enabled, like I said, pooling of assets and collective decision-making. So those two things exist with cooperatives. What they have, and I agree with Sylvie that it's based on contracts, but that what they have is an infrastructure of trust, which is already in existence. So it may not have a data trustee infrastructure, but it does have a sort of community infrastructure of trust, which ensures accountability that goes beyond even the contracts themselves. And there's a shared experience. There's shared values usually amongst cooperative members. And therefore, to me, that as a structure seems like a really, really good vehicle for us to experiment this idea of pooling and collectively governing data. So I think that we also have to think about the offline institutions that will enable sort of quote-unquote online action. And I think that we as human beings need those infrastructures that are physical, that are personal, that we can trust to negotiate and navigate the data economy. And so cooperatives to me are an interesting example to pursue.
I just want to follow up on that. You talked about, certain cooperatives or organizations that already have an institution of trust. What are some of the hallmarks that we should look for in either a cooperative or a society or maybe a given country where they have the needed trustworthy infrastructure, if you will, to institute this kind of mechanism?
So that's a discovery that we're still trying to make. So I think that for me, in the work that we do on data stewardship and looking at data co-ops, I think that obviously an existing data infrastructure, which I think a lot of organizations have, they're all connecting huge amounts of data about the communities, about their sort of professional lives, whether it's agriculture, whether it's fisheries. There's a ton of data being collected at the moment. So there needs to be there needs to be data to pool, which I think is now at this point, like I said, a foregone conclusion. We all have it. The second, I think, is that shared values of sorts. So everybody needs to be brought together to think about, how do you want to deploy this data? Where do you want to minimize harm? What kind of products you need, etc. So there needs to be some decision-making that needs to exist for that as well. And then there's a lot of big questions around the technological infrastructure that needs to be in place to be able to pool it, the legal infrastructure that allows for you to, port your data or pool it or delegate consent, and we're all in the process of figuring that out in the various jurisdictions that we work in. But I think that the embeddedness in the community is really critical, and to me that is the infrastructure of trust that I talk about, because at least again, and in a lot of countries this is probably true, that when you have a dispute to resolve, very few of us would take that small dispute through the legal recourse. A lot of people will rely on social norms, for instance, to resolve, or accountability that comes outside of legal recourse. And I think cooperatives, because of that structure, are able to do dispute resolution outside the legal boundaries, which might be a more effective way of going down when we think about pooling and this new system in some ways.
To make it. Just recovering. So everybody came here today to talk about the value of data, specifically the monetary value of data. So I know that that's not our favorite type of value that we want to talk about, but let's start with that. Is there a way for individuals to find monetary value in the data that is being collected about them? Sylvie, let's start with you.
Okay, I'll give a short answer to that one, but then I might add a note. So, yes, of course. So there's room for a multitude of approaches. So basically, one of the big advantages of building bottom-up empowerment infrastructure is that you acknowledge the fact that one-size-fits-all is actually not working when it comes to data governance. Different people have different aspirations and different attitude to risk. So it's super important to enable people to actually choose, whether it's a data co-op or a data trust, a structure that reflects their aspirations and their attitude to risk. Now, of course, there will be people for whom the top priority is to maximize the financial returns from their data. And as long as there is no legislation to limit the extent to which certain kinds of data can be monetized, by the way, I think there should be, but anyway, for the moment, there is not much of that, then there will be data trusts, data co-ops, etc., that will be focusing on maximizing financial returns. Now, what I hope, and you might call me an optimist, I'm very happy to be called an optimist, but I hope that there will be competition and there will be other offers out there in the scene where other data trusts will be saying, look, you can either get, let's say, I don't know, $50 back every year for your data, it's not going to be a huge amount, or we can build a data trust that's prioritizing first making sure that the data you're sharing is shared in an intelligent way that is not going to turn into a long-term vulnerability, one. And then two, we know that certainly I care about improving, say, healthcare, improving health research. I would love to share my data in a way that helps tackle the climate crisis, okay? But at the moment, do I have structures that would enable me to do this? No. So I can speak for myself, I would join a data trust that would fulfill A, the ambition of sharing data in a way that doesn't expose me and my family to long-term vulnerabilities, but B, also, equally importantly, I want to contribute to better healthcare, better education, better use of natural resources. And can I just finish with one example that I care really about? Now, I'm going to give you one example of a data trust that, if I was to create a data trust tomorrow, this is the one I would create, right? And it's an example of a data trust where there is no financial or monetary incentive at play, but there's a very strong one and a different one. Take schools. I don't know if you have kids, but during the COVID pandemic particularly, a lot of kids were submitting online homework, right? So a lot of data has been submitted by children to online platforms. Now, this is data that is directly provided to online service providers. Hence, at least in Europe, there are portability rights, okay? So we could ask to first have access to this data and transfer it to another entity. Now, do parents or children do that? No, of course not. Why would we do that? So here, we could create a data trust that says to parents and children in a school, if you want, you can join a data trust that's going to help you make the most of A, the data that your children are submitting online, and B, the data that the school has, in order to better understand the kind of education profile of your child. We know that different children learn differently. Yeah? It's incredible, actually, the difference it makes. For some kids to learn visually, others learn based on audio, etc. Now, if we could improve the education of the children in the data trust by putting together the insights from the online platforms and the insights from schools, say, already there's a significant value and incentive, which is not monetary. But further than that, you could also say, and what about improving the provision of remote education for kids around the world who don't have access to in-person education? Many kids around the world just can't go to school. The only solution is to have remote education. If, based on those insights that we would be sharing in a responsible way, we could improve remote education for a wide number of children, well, I'm in, right? And so this is an example of a data trust which is not structured around financial incentives, but nevertheless provides very real, tangible value.
Astha, can you talk a little bit about the community benefits? And then I'm going to step out. That we get from data collection.
So, like I said, in the example of the women's cooperatives that I mentioned, women could pool their data to get better loan rates, for instance, for the community. They could get better rates at the open market. But also, just wanted to go back to that question of monetization. I think that there is a certain temptation, right? Everyone is saying, oh, this is a data economy. And as soon as you bring that economic idea to a new space, it means monetary gives. And we've also been seeing that there are lots of initiatives like Andrew Yang's data dividends. He's recently joined something called, and it's interesting that this language gets appropriated, it's called data unions, which are again focused on monetizing your data. Now, also one has to realize that the individual give on data is very, very tiny. Your own data, and not to make anyone feel irrelevant, does not really matter. So it only matters when it's pooled. So the individualization of the data economy is actually and monetization is linked to that, is actually counterproductive to us safeguarding our rights and doing the things that Sylvie pointed out, which is to minimize harm and also to deploy data into issues that we care about. What they're going to do is that they're going to say, well, hey, we paid you, and then we are now empowered to use your data in the way that we'd like to. So monetization to me, and I'm less hopeful without regulation that they'll get competed out. I think that we need very strong regulation around monetization. And I also think that it'll create very many perverse incentives for, and as we know that not all people are the same and therefore not all data is the same. So there will be data that is more valuable. If you have higher consumption patterns, then Amazon is likely to pay more for your data versus people who don't spend so much on their platforms. So even, inequalities will be immense if data monetization is made the norm, which is also the call from a lot of technology companies. They're like, well, hey, if we buy it off you, then it's all, par for the course. So I think that we need to expand this definition of value much, much more. And also protection is a value that we don't acknowledge as much as we should. And the mechanisms that we've been talking about, whether it's data trusts or data cooperatives, allow for that protection and allow for that agency over data that we don't enjoy at the moment because of a very narrow frame of how we think about data rights.
What do we need to do to make sure some of those common goods that you talked about earlier are achieved?
Okay, well, the unsurprising answer to that is to say, let's build bottom-up empowerment infrastructure, right? And that's got to have a dimension that acknowledges the fact that we're not all the same. Some people will have aspirations that are very different from mine, right? So we need to create a variety of institutions, some which will prioritize, better use of natural resources, others that will be focused on financial incentives to the extent that regulation allows it, right? Now, that has to be key, unless there's a genuine choice and an ability to switch once your aspirations change, then I don't think this is really going to fulfill its potential. We need to also then encourage and grow a debate that is lacking at the moment. Very few people actually have any awareness that they're leaking data on a daily basis. And so there's much work to be done. But I am hopeful that as we create this bottom-up data empowerment infrastructure, it's also going to fulfill an education purpose, effectively, enabling a debate that's severely lacking at the moment.
So I'm going to start with Astha. What do you think is the most important, the most important thing that we need to do in order to achieve the most desirable future of data collection and data usage in the future?
Again, it's a complex answer because everything is a complex answer, but I think it again has to happen at different levels. So there's a policy conversation that we need to be having about expanding what we think is data rights, which again, a lot of us are starting to do. There's, like Sylvie said, the ability we need to start building more bottom-up institutions of any shape and kind and starting to have more conversations about data rights, how to pool them, how to use them, how to deploy our data more meaningfully. We need to empower different kinds of institutions, whether it's it's non-profits or cooperatives or labor unions, you name it, anything that allows people a vehicle to pool data is something that we need to be talking about much more. And we need to be working with stakeholders like the private sector as well as the government to build more infrastructure, like actual infrastructure that allows data to be pooled, that allows data to be exchanged, whether it's through data exchange layers or other kinds of data infrastructure. We need to start building those as public utilities. Because I think that the idea of the data economy being entirely privatized as it is at the moment needs to come down a bit more. And we need to also think about the public infrastructure around this. And I think that's going to be quite critical in the next. And like we said, this is not the future. I hope that this is very much the current, and then the next 3 to 5 years, which I think are really, really critical in helping us imagine a newer, more sort of equitable data economy.
How about you? What do you think is the most important thing?
Okay, what's the most important thing? At the end of the day, I want to think that this bottom-up empowerment infrastructure will change not just our relationship to data controllers, so reverse the power imbalance, but also, and this is critical, we need to reverse.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, dear all. I have a question. I mean, just starting from the concept that we are assuming that something that has value is because it has the power of monetization. Following this idea, and for example, if we go to technology, if, for example, the product is for free, maybe means that the product is you, not necessary. My question is, do you consider that in the future, the new luxury maybe will be the privacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that privacy as a concept is being monetized already, right? Like iPhone means privacy, and we've all seen those ads as well. So that's why, I mean, it's already happening because there's something, a fundamental right that we're now having to pay for through better technology or other things. I guess if I understand the question, is privacy a product?
No, privacy of ourselves. Our data is something that we are assuming that has a value because you can exchange in the future, maybe, that we are doing today. But maybe after 5, 7 years, the people will feel that they are losing their freedom because there is so many information around them that they cannot control, they cannot, So maybe in the future, do you consider that maybe will be better to keep, with you some kind of information as a private thing that you consider values, not because you can exchange, but because you can keep it with you?
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, well, okay, my answer to that one will be this. So you point, I think, at a problem that can be formulated like this. Yes, at the moment, the way in which we leak data on a daily basis is transforming our relationship to our past. So never before have we been in a situation where the self that we want to become can be constrained to that extent by the self that has been captured by sensors and monitors, etc. So that is one issue. But what I hope is that the bottom-up empowerment infrastructure we're talking about can actually shift that on its head and say, actually, data, instead of being a kind of limiting factor in your attempt to become different and to create change, data can be a lever for change if, and only if, we create collective structures of empowerment. So this is absolutely key. Yeah.
And also to add to that, I think that these institutions will give you that choice. If 5 years from now you want to keep that data private and you don't want to be part of this economy, and there are now rights like right to be forgotten, erasure, etc. Those are also getting coded into law that data intermediaries of any kind, bottom-up data institutions, will help you enact. So they will. I mean, the objective is to create choice for people in whatever direction they'd like to go to.
Thank you.
Yes, let's start in the back. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very exciting conversation. I'm Tea Danilov from Estonia, from the Estonian Foresight Center. And I wanted to ask Sylvie, if I may, a bit Eurocentric question. Well, beyond these data trusts, there is also the initiative of digital wallet. Where the individual is going to have the ability to command his or her data at every point of time, deciding upon with whom to share or for what purpose. And all the data are accessible at kind of via one and only application called the digital wallet. It's not existent yet, but the EU is trying to, well, there are some procurements of the enabling technology, etc. So I'm wondering how this digital wallet that basically puts the responsibility to the individual to decide with whom and why and when to share is compatible with the data trusts idea, where we should decide, or where we should delegate these rights to the trust. Thank you.
That's a great question. And okay, the short answer is yes, it's compatible. But the more interesting answer is, in fact, I had a chat before COVID. I was in the States talking to people involved with Solid and Tim Berners-Lee Pods initiative, right? So what you're talking about is personal data stores, right? Whether they're called digital wallets or anything else. Now, these are decentralization tools. Now, decentralization tools are important. They're important because they can help shift the power imbalance between the big data collectors and us. So I see them as having a use, but is it the answer? No. And why is it not the answer? Well, because it's assuming far too much in terms of agency and ability to make long-term choices that few people are equipped to make. Yeah. I even wouldn't feel confident making long-term decisions about the sharing of data X and Y on a daily basis. I would want to discuss that with someone whose job it is to look out for me and to monitor data sharing agreements on a constant basis. So these personal data stores, I am not trying to boo-boo them. Yeah, they have a role to play, but I don't think they should be seen as the beginning and the end of an answer. No, they can be useful. But ideally, I would have a data trust that sits on top of that, as effectively then mobilizing the personal data stores and putting them in touch with an intermediary, who's a real person, by the way, a data trustee, and who would help address those necessary, I'd call them frailties that we all share when it comes to making decisions on a daily basis.
We have time for one more question. Let's go right here. There we go. Microphone is on its way.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I have a comment and a question. One, it seems that you're placing good governance of data and monetization of data at different parts of the spectrum in very clear opposition. And I guess my question is why? It seems that there can be aligned incentives for those to coexist. But then secondly, privacy to some extent is a luxury for some. If most of the products right now are built for wage-earning white men, overwhelmingly, for somebody who does not fit that category, not sharing their data means products and services are not going to be able to serve them the way that they should. And so how do you see that working out? It's almost a need to share data to be able to ensure that you are part of a digital future and then you're part of a demographic that gets to be served by the digital economy. Thank you.
With the second question first, I think that, again, like I said, that we're hoping that at the moment, as people share data, you don't have a lot of say in it. As Sylvie said, we're leaking data all the time. And at the same time, the way products are being made for white men, for instance. And I think that we've all come across that book that says, like, you know, that the invisible gender, that like all technology is basically made for men. But if we were to have greater rights over our data as women in the global south or wherever else that we live, we would be able to deploy that data much more meaningfully. We would be able to understand where it's going and extract better products. Like, again, the example Sylvie said is that we would have the ability to port this data outside, for instance, Amazon, which is where we buy a lot of our products, to another intermediate or another e-commerce vehicle that might give us better choices. So what, again, we're trying to do through these bottom-up institutions is to enhance that agency and allow people to deploy their data in ways that make sense and exchange it for products that make sense for them, which is the effort that we're doing with the Women's Cooperative that is currently getting really, really very bad loan products because they don't have the right data. But we're helping them pool that and then negotiate with the bank to get better products. So yes, there is value in privacy. We're not saying that these mechanisms will enable people to not share their data at all, but to use their data more meaningfully and help answer the questions that they most care about.
Thank you for asking that question. It's critical. And my heart sank when I saw the title of this session, value monetization. Actually, the elephant in the room here is that data is an instrument of political empowerment too, and too few people talk about this, but it's critical. And we often forget that the right to vote wasn't universal until mid-20th century, often, or later, right? Now, I think data is becoming similar in the stakes, in the sense that, for instance, in the UK, there were land societies that were created so that, let's say, all the people in this room would pool money to acquire one piece of land, and then we'd cut that piece of land in like 100 little parcels, and we'd all have the right to vote, right? Because it was tied to land ownership. Now, today, I think it's a similar question at stake. How can we acquire a political voice, and can these this bottom-up empowerment infrastructure enable currently disenfranchised communities to get together and have a say over how they want to build the future? Absolutely. So it's a great question.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you for bearing with me at the worst possible moment for a coughing fit. I really want to thank Astha and Sylvie for participating today and for their really thoughtful insights. There is a book signing for Sylvie's book up on level 7 right after this. And if you didn't have a chance to answer the survey when you first came in, we're going to put those questions back up on the screen. So please take a moment to do so. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great day.